So, Dogman is the latest film from DreamWorks. And for being another film, like Captain Underpants, based on a similar type of kids book, I'm sure that Dogman is going to get immediate comparisons to DreamWorks' adaptation of Captain Underpants in his first epic movie, which I loved. I loved the creativity and just the experimentation and the sly humor, and the cleverness that it evokes from the books, which I will admit I am a little bit more familiar with the Captain Underpants books than I am with the Dogman books. So I'm sure, the immediate comparison is going to be, is Dogman as good as the Captain Underpants movie? And if you want a simple answer, the answer is no, but at the same time, I don't think it's an entirely bad film. I just think this is very much a different film that has different priorities and a different style. And specifically, I hate to do this, but I feel like there is a little bit more of a cutoff here in terms of the audience that it's going to be appealing to. Because with Captain Underpants, there were some genuinely hilarious moments that even as a parent, but even as an adult, I laughed a lot. I found it very clever. It was very fun, and I loved that they experimented with different 2D styles and the flip motion that they used, and using sock puppets at one point. Just all these little creative touches that I thought were just beautiful. Dogman is a little bit more simplistic in that it never really ventures outside of its kind of flat 2D style. It still has that kind of scribbly nature of misspelling words and just making up all sorts of weird ideas and inventions, and just kind of going with that kind of childish mentality. And it kind of sticks there, and on one level, that is very, for the younger audience, I think that's great, because I don't think there's going to be a moment here where the younger kids are going to have jokes that go over their heads. And no, it feels like these jokes are at just the right level that I think kids who have read the books are probably really going to love the film on that level. And I think I think a big part of that is just the manic nature of Dogman itself, because within the first few minutes we're quickly introduced to Dogman and his cop partner, who they try to stop Petey the evil cat here, voiced by Pete Davidson, from wrecking up the city, and they end up getting hurt in the line of work, and they end up having their bodies fused together, where the policeman Greg gets his face roughed up, and the dog gets his body roughed up, so they put the dog's head on the cop's body, and they just kind of go with it, and you don't question it much, and you just get into this new hero of Dogman that's kind of a fusion of both of them. And I think that's kind of a smart call, and having I think rushing through it really quick with the manic nature, I would say it's a little bit annoying, if not for the fact that if you did slow down, you would actually start questioning more aspects of identity and kind of body horror aspects that come with it, which they do a little bit of a winking at the camera before they start the surgery, and then they just kind of go with the flow with it. And I think that works out best for it, because you don't want to slow down too much to think about this scenario, because then it gets a little too dark here. I will say, though, that for the first act, that mostly just focuses on Dogman getting used to his new role, and clashing with the police chief, voiced by Lil Ray Howery, who's mostly just blustering the whole time. I think a little of that goes a long way. It's fast paced, and there's a little bit of cleverness, but in kind of a smile worthy, this feels like something a kid would come up sort of way. So in the same way that I felt Captain Underpants was all about these two clever kids coming up with a weird comic book idea, this is pretty much just, that weird comic book idea, and it's saddled there. Now for the first act, it's manic. It's all over the place. It's very fast paced. But and I think that, again, I think the pacing here prevented me from getting bored with the film or questioning its darker aspects. But a little of that went a long way, and it's okay, there's some cleverness here, it's fast-paced, it's got some decent slapstick here and there, but I'm really not digging on where, I really need more of a story to go with here. And thankfully, by the second act, it does kind of ground itself a little bit more, where you do start to care a little bit more about the characters. In particular, with the cat Petey, voiced by Pete Davidson, he decides to clone himself, but the clone of himself ends up being as a kind of like pint-sized kid version, and then so Petey has this little, innocent kid following him around, asking him all these questions about why he's evil, why he decided to pursue this life of crime, and just having this sweet dynamic between the two of them. Which I thought, okay, that's pretty cute. They could build on something there, and the film, it kind of builds on it and it kind of doesn't, because there is a bit of a payoff where Petey learns to see something more within the world through like the eyes of this child, which you could kind of guess was coming, but there isn't much of a build up to that point. It just kind of like arrives inexplicably, where like, the film realizes you need to care about these characters a little bit more and give a little bit more something to them. And I think that works best with Petey as opposed to like to Dogman, because Dogman seems like he just wants to find a place in this world and find people he connects with. And he kind of does through Petey's clone, more or less, and kind of like, learns to let go of the past and, just keep going on with like his police work and doing what's right and, saving the day without hurting anybody. But of course, that makes Petey a little bit more sympathetic. So there are some more villains thrown into the mix, like Petey's father, who's voiced by Stephen Root, who's just like a cranky kind of evil. And then you have the more over-the-top, cartoonish, Saturday morning cartoon villain angle with the evil fish, voiced by Ricky Gervais, who's a telekinetic cyber fish who turns the buildings of the city into monsters that Dogman and Petey have to end up stopping. So it's a very simplistic story, but I think that's okay for kids. And it does have a decent message, I think, by the end of it. Even if it doesn't really work out more towards that point. Like, because at one point, Petey brings up how he is evil, because the world is cruel and cynical, and like, there's pollution, and there's nothing much to look forward to in this world, and it just like, and just the world itself has made him such a cynical and hopeless and nihilistic person. And the problem is, this colorful city within like this childish landscape doesn't really set that up. It just kind of feels like that's all in Petey's head, where it doesn't really feel like a major problem or something that you sympathize with them as much. I think it's one of those aspects where, for adults who are more, familiar with our current landscape and how cynical the world has become, it will be relatable on that level. But I think for like, there might be some a little bit older kids who might question like, well, they didn't really set this world up to look like, to make sure that it would form someone like Petey. It just felt like he was just cartoonishly evil, and just did bad for the fun of it, instead of like, that being like a product of like his generational trauma and his dire straits. So they kind of fumbled the ball in that area. But where the film, I think, does succeed is just in its energy and pacing, which I have said, but I really have to stress that, because if you pay attention to all the subplots, they don't really pay off that much. Like, there is a developing romance between the police chief and the reporter Sarah Hadoff, voiced by Ilsa Fisher, and they really don't have any romance. So like, for the younger kids, if you're worried that there's going to be like kissing and romance, don't worry. This love affair is only like kind of declared outright, like once like the police chief just says like, oh, I'm secretly in love with you, and says this very loudly like 2 or 3 times throughout. And the joke is just that, he has to proclaim his feelings rather than display them. And that's pretty much how the rest of the film goes. And so I'm kind of, as an adult critic, I'm kind of like forced into this spot of like where I have to, recognize that, this is going to be built for much younger kids. They're going to love like the cartoonish charm, the misspelled letters like Super Cop and all that, and all the weird inventions and the scribbly drawings and like the cute innocence and the manic slapstick and all that. Kids are going to love it on that angle. But as for their parents, I think they might get a little bit bored and a little bit confused by how it just goes like, from incredible manic slapstick all over the place Saturday morning cartoon craziness to a grounding of like, Petey and Dogman meeting each other on the same level, where those two aspects really don't connect. And like, I don't I don't quite want to say like, okay, it's only for kids, or be a dismissive adult saying, well, as an adult I can't quite recommend it. So I am kind of like right down the middle here. I am in the spot where I'm just like, okay, there's some cleverness here and there, but the story really doesn't pay off, but the pacing's okay, and I think there's enough imagination and cleverness that I think kids will really dig on it. But outside of that, it's an okay animated film. Like, compared to what happened with, like, Captain Underpants, it's not as good. But that being said, it's still a fun film. I think, a lot of families are going to enjoy it. But if I'm being honest, mostly the kids are going to enjoy Dogman. So yeah, Dogman is not a bad film. It's not as great as Captain Underpants. It's definitely not as clever or experimental with its animation. But for young kids, I think it's clever enough that they'll enjoy it on that level.